Greetings to all my SAA friends and colleagues. I'd like to focus my remarks this afternoon on our culture as a professional society and to consider ways in which we might like that culture to change and to grow. We have laudable professional values that together offer us a solid grounding in who we are and what we are all about. And I hope it's apparent from previous communications that I believe in SAA's strategic plan, a plan that I think focuses our activities in what are very useful directions: advocating for archives, enhancing our growth as professionals, advancing our knowledge base, and meeting our members' needs. But it's always seemed to me that before you go out and do something, you really need to be something. So at this moment in our evolution, what are some of those things that we need to be that perhaps we have not yet become? In what directions do we need to move our culture? Let me suggest three that are top of mind for me. First and most important, we need to become a more inclusive profession. Second, we need to become a profession of advocates. And third, we need to become a profession of givers. So, first, becoming a more inclusive profession. SAA has cared about diversity for a long time. In her 2007 presidential address, Elizabeth Atkins noted that we had been working to address our diversity concerns for more than 35 years. In examining that history, Atkins settled on three areas where we needed to extend and intensify our actions: diversifying the archival record, diversifying the profession, and then diversifying SAA itself. From that day forward, those three diversification objectives have dominated the thinking of SAA leaders. Those three goals have been ever present in our values and in our strategic goals, but our progress, I would argue, has been incremental at best. As Atkins pointed out herself in her address, while it's easy to embrace the value of diversity, it's difficult to change the demographic makeup of a profession. All of this is very difficult work, perhaps the most difficult that we face as an association and as a profession. It is at best cold comfort to note that we are not alone. Libraries, museums, and other cultural institutions are wrestling with the same problems and are feeling the same inertial weight. But I have to think that we might speed up our progress if we were to stop focusing on achieving diversity itself and focus instead on practicing inclusion. We ought to be focusing our efforts, in other words, on becoming an association and a profession that truly values diversity. So, we might ask, what's wrong with concentrating on diversity? Well, in truth, we can never define diversity clearly in all its myriad aspects. Diversity quite naturally tends to fracture into more and more discrete identity groups. This makes it almost impossible for us to set a meaningful diversity agenda. We find ourselves focusing on a few things to the exclusion of many other things. It's bound to work out that way given how diversity works. The varieties of diversity that characterize our world just keep growing. But if we were instead to focus on the behavior of inclusion rather than on the fact of diversity, we might over time prevail and actually achieve a profession, association, and historical record that more truly embraces the diversity of our society. And behaving in an inclusive manner is something that we can all learn to do, and something that we can always learn to do better. Diversity is indeed a fact, but as I am always reminded by my colleague Chris Taylor, from whom you heard earlier this week, inclusion is a choice we make, both as individuals and as an association, a choice that increases our appreciation of diversity as well as our energy to embrace it. To fixate our attention on diversity leaves us questioning our direction and our strategies. What identity groups do we focus on? They are legion. What types of differences are the right priorities to embrace? But to focus on inclusion instead opens up some sensible paths forward and the hope of real progress. Because inclusion represents the set of tools that we can use to achieve the goals that are related to diversity. Diversity by itself doesn't lead to improved outcomes. Sometimes it leads to worse outcomes if it isn't married to inclusive outlooks and practices. We can pull a dizzying range of diversity into SAA or into our repositories, and yet see nothing emerge from it beyond frustration. We may find it very difficult, as happens in many workplaces, to retain employees from marginalized communities who, despite being brought into the organization, never do get to the point of feeling safe, respected, valued, or encouraged to be authentic. Bringing in diversity is no magic bullet, because having access to diversity does nothing to create in us the responses that place value on that diversity, that make use of that diversity, that welcome that diversity into our professional lives. Essentially, inclusion is a way of working with diversity to ensure that those outcomes are achieved. Inclusion only exists when the simultaneous needs that individuals have for belonging and uniqueness can both be satisfied. The shift from diversity to inclusion needs to happen at several levels. It certainly achieves its greatest impact at the marketplace or societal level. And to get to that level, it needs to be practiced first at the workplace and organizational level. But the work will gain no traction at either of those higher stages if it is not first understood and then practiced at an individual, personal level. To have any hope of effectiveness, the practice of inclusion must begin with us as individuals. And therefore, I sincerely believe that it's at this level, the individual level, where SAA needs to begin focusing its work. Before we attempt to diversify SAA or the archival record, we need to first rotate the lens and work on ourselves as SAA members. The way to begin doing this is through increasing our cultural competence as the first step in making us more inclusive individuals. What then is cultural competence? Janet M. Bennett, the executive director and co-founder of the Intercultural Communication Institute, a source of a lot of good learning on the topic, describes it as the set of cognitive, affective, and behavioral skills and characteristics that support appropriate and effective interaction in a variety of cultural contexts. If we concentrate our strategic efforts on inclusion, then we start from a perspective in which we see all of us as contributing valuable life experiences and perspectives to our profession. And we start then to approach each other with a spirit of curiosity and a willingness to engage. Getting to that point of comfort, curiosity, and engagement with our many differences is what is meant by cultural competence. It's a measure of how we respond to the experience of difference. Surprisingly, it doesn't appear that members of outsider groups or people who have experienced overt discrimination are necessarily more culturally competent than anyone else. We conducted an extensive baseline survey at the Minnesota Historical Society some time back and discovered that staff members representing a wide range of diversity were distributed quite evenly over a continuum of competence. In fact, research on the subject of inherent bias suggests quite strongly that we are all subject to deeply ingrained biases that can affect our reasoning, our behavior, our performance, and therefore our cultural competence. So recognizing that we are, all of us, every one of us, fellow travelers on a path to improvement in this regard, how can we begin to increase our competence? The first step is recognizing that there is a continuum of competence that can be divided into several somewhat discrete stages, leading from lesser to greater intercultural competence. At the beginning stage, we see a denial of difference, in which differences are perceived to be superficial and irrelevant. This is followed by a defense against difference. Individuals at this stage recognize difference but adopt a confrontational stance to it. This is the us versus them mindset. The next stage is minimizing difference, in which we see a broad brush belief that we are all the same. There is a failure to appreciate the effects of privilege and power imbalances at this stage. Then in the following stage, people demonstrate an acceptance of difference. Here there is, for the first time, a recognition and an appreciation of cultural differences, along with a curiosity that is non-evaluative and that seeks to understand. The next stage after simple acceptance is adaptation to difference. People at this stage begin to demonstrate a successful interaction across cultures and the beginnings of true empathy. And then the final stage represents the integration of difference, wherein individuals manifest a true multicultural perspective. The fact is that we all occupy some location along this continuum of cultural competence, and there shouldn't be any shame associated with the particular address that we happen to occupy right now. To be sure, our position is dynamic and tends to shift throughout our lives as we gain experience, learn, and grow. But we can all move forward, and that's the important point. Moving forward for each of us, and then for SAA as an organization, is what we need to do. We need to get ourselves moving along this path, and then we bring our workplaces, SAA, and our profession along with us. Look at me. I'm a 65-year-old white guy who has been fortunate enough to think and act from a position of relative privilege all my life. I've benefited from some ability and a lot of luck. I've had so many opportunities in my life that I could afford to squander half of them and still come out okay. But I've had recent opportunity to understand my own cultural competence and to gain some awareness of how I need to move forward. In my case, a combination of study and reaching out more to others. And to really appreciate the importance of that forward movement. We can all do this, and we must all do this to move our profession towards a more inclusive future. So then, knowing that we fall somewhere along this continuum, how do we start making progress towards our goal of competence? I believe that our efforts need to follow a certain critical path. First, the SAA Council needs to adopt a business case and a strategy for inclusion. Why do we want and need to do it, and then how do we do it? We are already taking some steps down this path, so we should be able to realize this objective in a fairly short time. Second, we need to assess where we are as an association. Thoughtful member surveys, key informant interviews, and focus groups can all help equip us with a baseline understanding of how SAA members are distributed in terms of awareness, motivation, and learning needs. Third, we need to assemble a suite of learning opportunities. The sorts of practical educational tools that can help us along are widely available in the marketplace. At the Minnesota Historical Society, for example, we've taken advantage of some excellent trainers, counselors, and tools that are provided by the Minneapolis YWCA, which has made inclusion training one of its core programs. And fourth, we must use this inclusion priority to start building a continuous quality loop into our operations. Specifically, we will need to establish some performance targets for our inclusion efforts and periodically reevaluate our position with follow-up surveys and focus groups. I want to return now to the crucial area of learning opportunities. The first step for each of us as individuals to learn about cultural competence, to understand where we fall on the continuum, and to begin the process of moving forward as individuals. This is a place where SAA can play a definite and important role, and in fact has begun to take some tentative steps. Through the good efforts of Council Member Helen Wong-Smith, Council members have participated in some introductory learning about cultural competence, have embraced the concept, and agree on the importance of carrying it forward for the organization. The next step, and it's not a small one, will be to roll out learning opportunities to as many SAA members as possible. How can we do this? As I noted, the sort of learning opportunities that can bear practical fruit, like training and cultural competence, are widely available. One good starting point is the Intercultural Development Inventory, a generally two-pronged tool that analyzes a person's intercultural competence and then follows up with a roadmap for personal growth. But even though learning tools are widely available, I also think that there may be a really significant role for SAA's continuing education program in providing learning opportunities that are more targeted and more relevant for the community of archivists specifically. There might well be a useful blend of licensed content married to home-brewed resources. Such a curriculum needs to address several pedagogical needs. First, it needs to be a curriculum that offers scaffolded learning. A combination of web-based information and training modules, in-person workshop-style sessions, as well as lecture offerings and so forth will be necessary. Then there should be cognitive learning, cultural knowledge, concepts of diversity and inclusion, the business case for D&I, and then deeper learning about microaggressions, unconscious bias, white privilege, and cultural appropriation, to name a few focuses. Then there must be affective learning. We need to address empathy, values, increasing our curiosity, and cultural flexibility in meaningful ways. And then there must be behavioral learning, developing practical skills in conflict resolution, cross-cultural communication, group dynamics, and team effectiveness. These capabilities are essentials in building an inclusive workplace environment. In short, we need to provide some new learning opportunities that greatly extend what we traditionally think of as the archival skill set. Needless to say, I would anticipate a large and very important role for the community of archival educators in helping us think through the requirements, the approach, and the mechanics of new learning aimed at our cultural competence as individuals and our inclusiveness as a profession. If our learning and our behavior about inclusion are not woven into the very fabric of SAA, through education, publications, outreach, advocacy, and governance, then we will make inadequate progress at best toward this crucial goal. In this regard, I envision a rich SAA microsite that is devoted to providing learning and assessment tools designed to equip SAA members with at least a portion of the knowledge, resources, and skills to move them along on their own journeys, and then to take those new attitudes and abilities into their workplaces. So, we begin our journey of inclusion with learning. Then what? We need to move from awareness to behavior, from ourselves to our workplaces and the marketplace, from individual behavior to policy and procedure. There are obvious starting places in our repositories. We can begin with our hiring practices, where a lot of work needs to be done. Our recruitment strategies, our position descriptions, our application processes, and our interview protocols are all areas where long-standing traditions and policies may hide roadblocks to achieving a diverse archival workforce. We should challenge past assumptions about job requirements and the mechanics of the selection process, and do everything we can to be more inclusive in our hiring. And our retention strategies, or lack thereof, may also be harming us. We probably lack effective and appropriate onboarding practices, employee resource groups, performance management processes, and the sort of respectful workplace policies that can make a real difference in our collective ability to retain a diverse workforce. And as we begin to enjoy successes in our workplaces, growing and then retaining a more diverse workforce, SAA and the archival profession will become the direct beneficiaries. SAA can't create an inclusive profession in itself, but it can surely help its members to carry out that critical work in the places where they have some real agency. Then we need to keep doing all the things that we are currently doing. Mosaic scholarships, diversity-focused internships, the work of the Diversity Committee, since we are beginning to get some real traction through all of these related efforts. One final thought on this topic. An upward journey toward greater inclusion will require us to work together with the understanding that we all bring different baggage on the journey. Different life experiences, different levels of cultural competence, different perspectives, different senses of urgency. Progress will require dialogue, but we need to keep that conversation free of bitterness and harsh invective. We are all beginning from different starting points, so we need to be patient with each other and help each other along. We can't change our past, but we can definitely shape our future. Let's learn, lead, and grow together in this important effort. Second today, becoming a profession of advocates. Another thing that we really need to become, is an association of advocates for archives. And I want to make it clear that I mean advocacy in its broadest possible sense. I don't simply mean improving our ability to argue for improved funding and beneficial legislation. Those skills and activities are, without a doubt, hugely important. But I guess I'm talking about going beyond those practical and specific activities and becoming instead true advocates for our shared mission and values as archivists. And being those advocates on a routine daily basis with our consumers, our stakeholders, and with each other. In his 2008 presidential address, Mark Green held up a set of 10 broad principles that he believed should be mutually embraced as a set of core values for archivists. An adjusted version was adopted by SAA Council as comprising that essential set of values that we can all believe in: access and use, accountability, advocacy itself, diversity, history and memory, preservation, professionalism, responsible custody, selection, service, and social responsibility. I believe that the first and perhaps the most important step in advocacy is to understand and own those values. Each one of us. That conviction in the importance of the archival mission and its supporting values is essential to advocating the importance of the profession and its work to any outside constituency. If we don't own it, we can't sell it. We can't possibly persuade any external audience that archives have value. As I argued in talking about inclusion, I do contend that our first step must be to work on ourselves, to educate ourselves about the value of archives and the value that we create as archival professionals. The important outcomes will surely be realized higher up the advocacy chain. But before any of that can happen, we must first develop ourselves into competent advocates. I think that advocacy comprises a few essential things, among them conviction, evidence, communication, and persuasion. Conviction encompasses our belief in the value of what we do, as I've just discussed. Evidence comprises the information resources that we can present to support that conviction. Communication involves everything we do to present that evidence to our stakeholders. And persuasion is, ultimately, our ability to be effective in everything that we communicate. Kathleen Rowe, a tireless champion of archival advocacy, made clear in her presidential address last year that we archivists are very good at explaining what we do and how we do it, but we are much less skilled at explaining why we do it. I would suggest this indicates that we have work to do in all four areas: in the strength of our convictions, the evidence at our disposal, our ability to communicate the most important evidence, and our knowledge about how to persuade. So how do we move this endeavor forward and become effective advocates? There are several things that we need to do, and they break down into three areas. First, the compelling stories that we can tell. Second, the evidence that supports those stories. And finally, an infrastructure of tools and resources that enable SAA members to make full use of both. Much of the advocacy groundwork that we have accomplished to date has focused on establishing a theoretical basis for the value of archives, their contribution to preserving legal and political rights, providing evidence to support truthful historical narratives, and so forth, and then providing compelling stories that illustrate, sometimes very dramatically, the power that archives have demonstrated to change lives. This lattermost was a powerful theme in last year's annual meeting, and Kathleen's address did an admirable job of expressing the value of those storytelling activities. To support this work in a sustainable way, we have created two standing SAA committees that can keep pressing this work forward. The Committee on Public Policy, which keeps us focused on federal and state legislation, and the Committee on Public Awareness, which develops and executes an agenda for advocating in non-governmental arenas. These are important steps, but the next step needs to concentrate on gathering, evaluating, and presenting the real quantitative and qualitative evidence that supports all the compelling narratives and theoretical arguments that we can make about the value of archives. We need this evidence because we've struggled for many years with the challenge of demonstrating the value of archives via anything representing objective measures. We know too little about whom we serve, how much they gain from interaction with our holdings, and the real practical impact of our work to make an effective case about resource needs, return on investment, or value. Our previous attempts at data gathering, while distinctly valuable in many ways, have nevertheless been too self-referential to answer those questions. And our previous strategies for making the case for resources, basing our arguments primarily on who we are, how many collections we hold, or how many tasks we perform, has not been effective. Instead, I believe we must develop an understanding supported by meaningful data of who our users are, what services they value, how they want to use our collections, and then which potential users we are not currently serving. We must understand the real economic impact of archives and archivists on their communities, on things like employment, local spending, educational contributions, volunteer opportunities, and even tourism. Our goal in this regard is to provide access to compelling data about American archives and their users that speaks to the value of archives for society and that also helps us improve our services to our consumers. This is big work. So how do we take it on? I've been chewing on this problem for a year now and have come to believe that our best way forward is to create another standing committee. This one, focused at least in part on gathering, analyzing, and presenting data that can really measure and explain the value created by the archival enterprise. However, I think that such a committee could perform much more for SAA than this single function. We can imagine its mission more broadly as being a center for a wide variety of research, data gathering and analysis, project development and management, and knowledge dissemination that can serve SAA members in many different ways. Just for a start, let's call it the Committee on Research and Evaluation, acronym CORE. It would function as a center for conducting and evaluating research that is practical, meaningful, and useful. CORE gathers quantitative and qualitative information of strategic value for our efforts relating to advocacy, public awareness, improved audience services, and community engagement. CORE evaluates this information and surfaces it to members via dashboards, reports, and constructed data sets that members can use to better understand and act upon their own environments. Allied professional associations are already embarked on this sort of effort. The American Library Association has its Office for Research and Statistics, whose mission is to provide leadership and expert advice to ALA staff, members, and public on all matters related to research and statistics about libraries, librarians, and other library staff. Similarly, the Alliance of American Museums has its Central Research Program, whose goal is to provide sound and current data to support the Alliance, its members, and the museum field. They both conduct and commission original research about America's libraries and museums, collect and synthesize benchmarking data, monitor external research, and collaborate with other organizations on research projects of interest to their members and their professions. By creating standing research arms within their operating structures, these associations have positioned themselves to commission, gather, and evaluate information critical for their members in serving their audiences better, demonstrating their value to society, and expanding their professional knowledge base. SAA's position as a professional association that serves members employed by the great majority of U.S. archival repositories gives us a gateway to an immense amount of captured and uncaptured data, and it affords us a unique opportunity to survey, to test, and to evaluate a comprehensive population of archivists. This committee could become a very useful skunkworks, too, within SAA to serve the larger archives profession. We would share the results of our studies so that others can learn from them and so that our profession can remain strong and vibrant. CORE's work would be guided by a few essential values: objective research, strategic importance, collaborative approaches, and shared knowledge. CORE might function by organizing itself dynamically into ad hoc and long-term research teams that would study particular strategic problems of broad interest and relevance to SAA members. These teams would be collaborative and drawn from across the membership. The teams would work in partnership, sharing data, methods, insights, and personnel. Teams could form and disband as required by the dictates of their particular projects. Some core teams might be very academic in terms of their objectives, approaches, and personnel. They would work on problems and methods that demand scholastic rigor. Others might be very pragmatic and businesslike efforts, intended to move quickly towards a practical solution or understanding on some more immediate and discrete issue. At least some core teams could expect modest funding to facilitate their work from SAA operating funds, from the SAA Foundation, or from external grants. At its heart, a committee on research and evaluation would provide our members with a common foundation of information to understand and act on a wide variety of issues that affect them. It would be an initial step in creating a real business intelligence capability for the association, as well as developing an appreciation for data analysis and evaluation among archivists. It could offer up a number of extremely valuable services that are presently lacking in SAA. A repository and analytical tools for sharing and evaluating useful data about archivists, repositories, audiences, and the environments in which archives function. Also, a training site for archivists in the area of business intelligence. A mechanism that can proactively commission necessary and strategic research, rather than just passively waiting for it to occur on its own, as we currently do. A persistent team of SAA members that's positioned to look strategically at the organization's information needs. Another SAA member has suggested that we might begin this effort with the convening of program officers from large grant makers like IMLS, NEH, NHPRC, and Mellon, funded by the SAA Foundation and aimed at advising SAA on how to pursue this business intelligence initiative effectively. Regardless of how we get it off the ground, I believe that doing so is within our reach, and I believe that the resulting work will repay SAA richly for any investments that it makes. And finally, becoming a profession of givers. The things that I've outlined so far obviously all require resources, and probably new resources. So I want to close by talking about how all of our aspirations depend upon an essential infrastructure of people, technology, and money. Money won't buy us happiness or goodness, but it certainly offsets the cost of everything else we care about. A professor of public administration at the University of Minnesota is fond of reminding nonprofits that there is no mission without a margin, meaning for us that while SAA as a professional association is driven by its mission to serve the rather wide-ranging professional needs of American archivists, it can't possibly realize that mission without getting into the business of making money. No margin, no mission. SAA's resource infrastructure has traditionally depended on four sources of revenue. They are membership dues, annual meeting income, workshop fees, and publication sales. We do a pretty good job monitoring all these revenue streams and then seeking opportunities to enhance them and to drive each of them just a little bit harder. But I would argue that we have neglected a fifth revenue stream that must grow in significance if we are to ensure ourselves the most solid resource possible for our future. That revenue stream depends upon philanthropy, and specifically upon SAA members as givers. Every successful nonprofit can boast of having a strong resource or a strong donor base, and in SAA's case, that donor base is primarily its members. We have been very successful thus far in creating a membership of takers, and I mean that in the best possible way. Members who consume SAA's products and services on a sort of pay-as-you-go basis. But what we need to become is an association of givers. That is, members who go beyond paying for what they consume directly, donating in excess of that as a way to create a stronger, more resilient organization that can realize its mission in more powerful ways. The emerging SAA Foundation is the mechanism that lets us accomplish this. The foundation is moving beyond its infancy into its training pants stage, which of course is a big step forward but still requires a lot of attention. It's already doing good work for us, It funds the Mosaic Scholarship Program, which has benefited a cohort of emerging archivists, and which helps move our diversity efforts forward. It funds the Pinkett Minority Student Award, which recognizes student achievements that serve as models for all of us. It also funds a fledgling grant-making program. It provided R&D funds that resulted in the DOS curriculum and certificate program, as well as R&D funding for several book publishing projects. But the foundation is capable of doing a whole lot more than it's able to do right now. It can fund the sort of cultural competence training and other initiatives aimed at growing our inclusivity. It can certainly help support innovative research and experiments that would come out of a committee on research and evaluation. The unbudgeted funds in the foundation are available to try out any number of good ideas. They can help us become more nimble and quick to respond to opportunities as well as to crises. We cannot do those things now, but we can do them as the funds within the foundation grow. The foundation's growth is in our hands, and it is within our abilities as members to make that growth happen. Philanthropic giving is an American value. In 2015, Americans contributed more than $373 billion, 80% of which came from the annual gifts and bequests of individuals. By the same token, giving, for the purpose of strengthening the archival profession, needs to become a value owned by SAA members, by all of us. In holding up this value, I am very cognizant of the fact that it might ring hollow with many new or younger members especially, who live with constant financial stress and who would be hard-pressed to contribute beyond their annual dues. But I also know that our circumstances change over the years, and that giving to the institutions that have sustained us and made positive contributions to our lives eventually becomes an important value for all of us. So this becomes another thing that we ought to be as SAA members. And to bring this thinking today to a close, I'll reemphasize that our strategic directions are, in my estimation, good ones. They're definitely carrying us forward. But we should always make an opportunity to step back and think about what we want to be before we keep surging ahead with all the things that we want to do. In my mind, the three things that I've talked about this afternoon are the bare necessities that we should be adding to the basket of things that we aspire to. Above everything else, we should be moving our diversity strategy forward by using every resource at our disposal to become a more inclusive association and profession. Secondly, we should invest more of our individual and team efforts and our associational resources into business intelligence efforts and mechanisms that support our advocacy initiatives as well as other important work. And finally, we need to help ourselves become more impactful SAA members by embracing the value of giving to support the association, both for its practical outcomes and because it's a very good thing to do. I hope that we will all find it in our hearts and minds to own these values and to use them as a platform for refreshing our strategic agenda and moving it forward, to help SAA be the best organization that it can possibly be for all of us. Thank you very much.